Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Evren Balta, and I'm in Istanbul with Soli Özel, and Fiona Hill. Dr. Fiona Hill is joining us from Berlin. Hello, it is really a pleasure having you here with us today, this afternoon, and thank you for joining us. Let me introduce you very briefly, and then Soli is going to be asking our first question. Dr. Fiona Hill is a senior fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings Institution. In November 2022, Dr. Hill was appointed Chancellor of Durham University, United Kingdom. She is currently a fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin. From 2017 to 2019, she served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs on the National Security Council. Dr. Hill has researched and published extensively on issues related to Russia, Caucasus, Central Asia, regional conflicts, energy, and strategic issues. She is the author of There Is Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century, my personal favorite, and co-author of Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin, which is a crucial book to understand the Putin's regime and the background of what's going on in Ukraine. Dr. Hill, thank you again for joining us today. We have many questions to you, very eager to hear your perspective on the current situation with regard to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But let me first, again, take a couple of minutes and remind you of some simple housekeeping rules. Our event is going to be in English, but we are providing simultaneous translation from English to Turkish. In order to switch to Turkish, what you need to do is to press the translation button. Where is it, the translation button? I think it's at the bottom of the screen. Please press that button. You can ask your questions by using the Q&A section, and I will be directing them to Dr. Hill as they come. And having said this, let me ask Soli to...
Sure.
Okay.
Hello, Fiona. I just want to add that you are, for me, a very good friend and definitely a heroine for your appearance at the committee meetings. And our audience would probably also like to know that you also wrote actually a seminal piece years ago with our common friend and colleague Ömer Taşpınar, Russia and Turkey, the coalition of the excluded, whatever. I mean, I think it was the coalition of the excluded. So welcome. Now we'll start with, obviously, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. What is the situation on the ground as you see it, and you're in Berlin? And really, what does victory or what does defeat mean for either side, Ukraine or Russia, at this juncture? And from your perspective, was the US response adequate, right? And has the Biden administration really got the conflict's dynamics right? And is this a turning point for Europe and for the transatlantic alliance? Did it come at a time when, did it really stop the erosion of the tides between the two shores of the Atlantic? And what's next?
Well, thank you so much, Soli. Those are great questions, and it'd be fantastic if I had the answers to all of them. And perhaps after a little bit more time here in Berlin, I might. Just to clarify for all of our colleagues from TÜSİAD, I haven't moved permanently to Berlin. I'm actually doing something that Soli himself did. In fact, his picture is on the wall of fame of the Bosch Foundation fellows right outside my office. So if I took you outside, you could see Soli's picture right on the right-hand side of my door. I'm not sure if I'm in the office Soli was when he was here, but this is a 5-month fellowship, in fact, to examine some of these issues, but in the kind of larger political context here. And I will be returning to Brookings, to where I'm usually, when you normally see me, at the end of July. And obviously things are quite different from Berlin than they do in the United States. And I think that part of that last question that Soli asked about the revitalization of the transatlantic alliance and the kind of the role of the West there and its coherence, I think that's still a question mark, and I'll come back to that in that response to what's next, because I would like to start where Soli started with the questions about what does the war look like. Well, again, the war is raising all kinds of images for many different people, and people's reference points and analogies and the concepts in which they use often differ depending on where you are. I mean, I'd be very interested to hear what it looks like from the perspective of Turkey, in the course of the discussion, especially given the news from yesterday about the downing of a drone over the Black Sea. I'm sure that this is bringing a lot of anxiety in a very different respect for Germany, for Turkey than for Germany. For example, it would look very different, from your vantage point. And I think that that's really important to bear in mind, because I think that the way that the United States looks at this war and the conceptions of what's happening are very different from Europe, and European countries all have very different perceptions as well. And I'll get to that in just a second. But first of all, the war is unfortunately looking more and more like it's grinding into a very unstable stalemate. This is very reminiscent in many respects of World War I. Again, this goes back to those analogies and those frames that one brings. I'm sure that everybody in Turkey has seen the pictures of Bakhmut and the trench warfare that's going on in and around Donetsk and Luhansk and the whole of the Donbass region. And in their minds, if they've ever seen pictures of World War I, there's been the juxtaposition in various newspaper articles of pictures from the battlefield of Verdun, where, of course, Germany suffered an enormous loss in World War I, and, the juxtaposition of the fronts in the Donbass region. It's very hard to tell the difference between the two. At the same time, if you've seen any of the aerial shots recently taken by drones or by aircraft of places like Bakhmut or Mariupol, Maviinka, all these places that most people have never heard of, apart from people like me who've been studying the region for a long time, and they look reminiscent of Stalingrad or Dresden or, anywhere, during World War II. And then we've got these 21st century elements of drones, in which Turkey obviously has played a major role with the first provision of drones to the Ukrainians very early on, which may in fact have been, frankly, one of the triggers for the conflict, because the Russians were worried about the Ukrainian use of drones, back in 2021, for example, when Ukraine started to use them on that front line, the contested front line in the Donbass region. We've got the digital and cyber aspects of everything. And this is a war that all of us are seeing in real time. I mean, I just, every morning I look at various things on YouTube. You're kind of seeing this war playing out in real time in ways that we never did in World War I and World War II, where we relied on dispatches. Articles in newspapers came weeks after the main battles had taken place, or in the case of World War II, on film reels, people would see everything in the cinema. Now you can see it on your smartphone. As you're walking down the street, you can see what's happening in this war. And that actually has an enormous impact on that question of victory or defeat that Soli asked at the very beginning. First of all, as I said, the war looks like it's getting into the kind of grinding, bloody, senseless stalemate that we saw with World War I. Maybe we saw with World War II as well, absence of decisive battles. The Russians are throwing absolutely everything that they've got at it, from, cutting-edge missiles, the Hinjal, other missiles that can actually be nuclear-tipped, but they're using these hypersonics and others, obviously showing that they want to have the most devastating effect, but that maybe, they're running short on other equipment and ammunition and missiles, for example, and then they're throwing more and more manpower at this. And, if it's true that Russian casualties, including dead and injured, are in the realm of 200,000, then that is shocking. Because in Afghanistan, Soviet casualties, remember, this is a population of 270 million at that point in the Soviet Union, as opposed to 145 million in Russia. And that was Ukrainians and Armenians and Georgians and Kazakhs in the Soviet military as well. That was 14,000 people in a tenth of the time in terms of total losses. So this is a devastating loss. Again, that's why the World War I analogies come into play. World War II, of course, 50 million, people killed, but that's over a, protracted period of time. But it's that World War I, that kind of senseless carnage of soldiers, cannon fodder. The whole imagery that we have of World War I seems to be playing out now, and the Russian and Ukrainian casualties being so high. And then again, as I'm saying, we're watching this all the time. We are participants in this war. whether we think of it or not, but in the terms of the way that we are taking on information and that we are watching the war, we're protecting or lending our support for Ukrainians or whatever role that we're playing here. And that's what I mean about the references to victory and defeat. It's in the eyes of the beholder. Already, many people believe that Vladimir Putin has basically been defeated. Defeated in the sense of when he launched the special military operation a year ago in February, the whole idea was to take Ukraine in a matter of days, if not a couple of weeks, and topple the government in Kyiv. It was supposed to be a special military operation, not a war. That would have been minimal application of violence. Believed that the Ukrainian military would disappear, would crumble, and the Ukrainian political system would fall apart, and then there would be someone put in place as Russia's choice of president, and perhaps then Ukraine, along with Belarus, would be part of a new Slavic union with Russia, where Putin himself would be presiding over a kind of a new entity, which would justify his continuation as president, out till 2036 or however long he intends to stay in power. Now there was the defeat of that idea. That doesn't mean to say it's going to be a continued, defeat per se, in this kind of in a war of attrition, but it's a defeat of those original objectives from the war. And in that regard, Ukraine has already, the Finns and others would say, kind of achieved a great victory, because like Finland in 1939 and 1940, during the Winter War of World War II, when the Soviet Union invaded Finland in the wake of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Germany, the Finns actually fought the Russians off, but they lost ultimately a vast swathe of territory, 10% of Finnish territory of Karelia in the subsequent peace deal with the Soviet Union, but they won their independence. Now, we don't know how this is going to play out ultimately, and that comes to the real difficulty that we have here, Soli, which is, I'm sure, why you phrased the question as it has. I think we're all grappling now with, it's very hard to imagine how this war is won on the battlefield. It's hard to imagine that there will be, like in World War I, a Verdun, where Germany is basically dealt a massive defeat, and it leads to the crumbling of the Kaiser's system and the German political system, and ultimately the armistice of 1918. It's hard to imagine that kind of thing happening in this scenario. It's also, lots of people, including, of course, Putin, are trying to present Bakhmut as Stalingrad, the sort of decisive battle of World War II that ultimately then has a knock-on effect that leads to not just the strategic overreach of Nazi Germany, but its ultimate defeat. Stalingrad is then followed by battles, obviously, in the West as well as on the Eastern Front. And then, eventually we kind of move towards, over the course of a year or more, almost a year, the defeat of Germany. It's hard to imagine that happening either to Ukraine or to Russia. So, the question is it possible to imagine, some process of ending this war that is somewhere in the middle of victory and defeat, and that takes place at some kind of negotiating table eventually? Now, personally, like I think many people, that's the only way that I can see that this is most likely to end. Although I am not ruling out some decisive victory, something that has some kind of, knock-on effect on the battlefield. I mean, all kinds of things can happen, as we know. There are wild card scenarios, black swans, whatever we want to call them. There are all kinds of things that could actually happen here. But the biggest challenge is trying to figure out how one would push Russia, in particular, towards a negotiating table to basically settle for something less than what Putin has laid out. So victory for Putin, frankly, is still maximalist. It's still basically the subjugation, capitulation of all of Ukraine, and the imposition eventually of some other government. And if you look at Georgia, which was invaded by Russia in 2008, look where Mikhail Saakashvili is now. He's sitting in jail in a very different Georgia from what one might have envisaged in 2008, 2009. He left power in 2013, obviously ends up in Ukraine, has a kind of rather strange journey, let's say, but has now ended up in a jail in Georgia. And Georgia's whole European trajectory, seems to be completely, off the books. Could that happen for Ukraine in the future? I'm sure that's kind of basically what Putin would like to see at some point. But even in a minimal capacity, what Russia wants or Putin wants as victory is very clear. It's the recognition of the annexed territories, not just of Crimea from 2014 or of Donbass in its entirety, but also Zaporizhia and Kherson. Now, it's possible to imagine that Russia might settle for, and has been signaled by Dmitry Peskov and Sergei Lavrov and others, the borders in which Russian troops are now manning on that front line across the Dnieper River from Kherson and Zaporizhia. But there's no way that Putin is going to voluntarily, unless there's a massive constraints building up, give up on the rest of Kherson and Zaporizhia. And we can talk a little bit, kind of more about that. Now, all of those scenarios represent a defeat for Ukraine, because a victory for Ukraine can only be in reclaiming as much of its territory as it possibly can, if not all of it. Although, we know that the Ukrainians were willing to discuss the possible status of Crimea over a negotiation, a year ago. But obviously the brutality and the atrocities that we've seen in the war since has made that also kind of a question mark. Again, I think we can talk about this later, because all of that then feeds into the next part of Soli's question about, have we got the response right? And I think, Soli, you asked about the US, and I think that honestly that's, in a way, if we just think about the United States, then the response will never be right, because the only way really to get a resolution of this conflict is to have a larger multinational frame. Because Putin would like the whole world to think that this is a proxy war in Ukraine between the United States and Russia, or the United States and NATO, but NATO has been a US bloc and Russia. And obviously that's not the case. This is a very complex conflict. Every country, has a different view, as I said at the very beginning, of what this conflict is. For Europe, for sitting here in Germany, this is a massive turning point. I just came from a lunch with the head of the Bosch Foundation here in Berlin, and that was the whole discussion. It was about, what Germany's calling the Zeitenwende, which is a turning point for Germany, of realizing all its previous assumptions about the kind of its political, economic, and social development were based on a system, a transatlantic system, a European security system, an economic system that has now been upended. Europe is now a continent once again at war, like in World War I and World War II. And all those analogies are very present, and they're very real in different ways for different countries. Obviously, Germany is having an awful lot of guilt. Guilt before was a kind of I think a reference point for Germany in its relations with Russia, always trying to improve those relations. Now there's guilt for overlooking, kind of really the aggression that Russia was demonstrating towards Ukraine and other countries, Georgia included, and a kind of a feeling that they'd let Ukraine down as well as Poland and many of the neighbours here. So this has completely shifted Germany's perspective, and I think there's a national reckoning, an existential crisis going on here, which, if I'd come here earlier, I wouldn't have seen playing out. In the United States, we see this all being tied up in United States domestic policy. I do think actually that the Biden administration has had, the right response, to an extent. But again, it's not all about the United States. And if it starts to be all about the United States getting the response right, then the whole support for Ukraine, or the whole longer term discussions of what is this war, how is it a turning point, what does it mean for the third party, a question about the transatlantic relationship could founder, could collapse, because US domestic politics is so fractured and polarized, to some extreme, that we can already see Ukraine becoming a feature of domestic politics, just as Russia did after 2016 and the interference in the Russian elections. We can see Ukraine as being now the kind of the new organizing principle for populists. Just think about what Ron DeSantis, one of the would-be presidential candidates for 2024, has been saying recently, the current governor of Florida, for example. So that third point of Soli's question about this is a turning point for Europe, I think, is really the critical one, and that includes Turkey. Is Turkey still part of Europe? Does Turkey see itself as part of Europe? Is Turkey, like other European countries, going to kind of figure out whether this is sort of a turning point in the way that it conducts its relationships with its immediate neighbours, as well as with Russia, Ukraine, and in the transatlantic sense? What does this mean for NATO? Clearly for Sweden and Finland, the answer for them, and for Finland especially, given its experience of 1939 and 1940, this is like the experience that Turkey had in 1949, and 1950, which prompted Turkey to want to join NATO because of the threat coming from the Soviet Union, Finland sees now, in the way that Russia has behaved, a dramatic shift in its security environment, in a way that Russia was returning not just to the idea of the Soviet Union, but also to the Russian Empire, and Finland was part of that empire. And Finland doesn't want to be part of that again. And so Finland is overturning decades of deliberate neutrality and also always trying to organize its relationships with Russia bilaterally. And the Finns prided themselves on having managed their relationship with Russia probably better than any other country. And this very dramatic now push to get into NATO, because they see European security as being determined not by a new Helsinki Final Act or the OSCE, as they'd actually just a few years ago were talking about Helsinki 2.0 having a whole new rethinking of the OSCE as a way of dealing with Russia, but because they feel that hard security is essential in the near term. And that, although they don't want necessarily NATO to go back to its old Cold War origins, they see NATO as the only existing mechanism for pushing back on what Russia is trying to do and re-establishing European security. And I know that Finland would rather Turkey was part of that than, standing apart from it. And same, for Sweden. Sweden's had hundreds of years of neutrality, but the Swedes are now seeing, the same situation unfolding here. And of course, Sweden was the old imperial challenger to Russia when Russia extended into the lands of Ukraine, back in the 1700s. Now, different countries see things in different ways. Obviously, Hungary has a different vantage point. Poland and the Baltic states have always been in this position. But the real question here, I think, is still up for debate about, Soli, your answer is whether this has, revitalized transatlanticism or whether it's actually going to put it on a new footing. I suspect it's going to be actually the latter. Because I think that even though we see, as I said, Finland and Sweden, wanting to join NATO, NATO getting a boost, it's not going to be the old NATO of the Cold War. I think this is, many of the countries that are re-embracing NATO see this as essential for the medium term, but for the longer term, they realize there's going to have to be a rethinking of European security. And I think, just to make a segue now into the rest of the discussion, that's going to be a challenge for Turkey. Because Turkey is going to have to decide whether it wants to be part of that new European security mechanism or it wants to be outside of it. And tied to that is new multilateralism. Because I do also see that this war has revitalized. I'm sorry, my throat's a bit sore here, so I'm kind of feeling a bit hoarse. Excuse me, just have some water. The war has also revitalized the United Nations, and this is somewhere where Turkey's played a very important role, and we'll have to figure out what happens now with the Black Sea grain deal, what happens with this downing of the drone, and some of the knock-on effects that might have. But the United Nations' role in looking at war crimes and atrocities, refugee crisis. This is the largest refugee crisis since World War II. It's larger, obviously, than Syria and everything that's happened before. But also, the question about the future, the violation of the UN Charter, territorial integrity, sovereignty, independence, restoring global norms, the UN's going to have to play a very important role. So there's going to be a kind of a knock-on effect here as also does this revitalize multilateralism. Can this be, and I know that Turkey's very interested in this kind of, supercharging the General Assembly, even if not the Security Council, where, obviously the fallacy of having, a country that's invaded another, and plenty of people will talk about the United States doing that during, the Iraq War, for example, or Afghanistan, but the fallacy of having, one of the Security Council members being, the perpetrator of all of these atrocities is, kind of revealing of the weakness of that particular structure. But at the same time, the United Nations General Assembly, all the resolutions and all the special offices of the General Secretary have also come into play in this conflict as well. So I personally think that we're in for a whole overhaul of the international system and the European security system as a result of this conflict. But right now, I don't see where this conflict ends, although inevitably I believe it has to end at a negotiating table. But the question is how? How do we get there? Because as Soli started at the very beginning, the definition of victory and defeat is not just in the eye of the beholder, but a victory for one side, absolute victory for either side doesn't seem likely. And the question is, how then you lessen the effects of, what's inevitably going to be a defeat for both sides' maximalist objectives to find something that we could use as the beginning of a process, to eventually find resolution. And I don't believe we'd do that for many, many years, honestly. This is not going to be, in my view, like a World War I, World War II with an armistice and something signed and us all moving on from this. This war is going to be with us in many different ways for years to come.
Super, thank you. There's a follow-up question from the audience about the fractures that you were talking about within the US, and someone, Tarek Bashkuboglu, is asking whether you could talk about a little bit about the US position and the position of the Republican Party and the fractures within the US. And I have a follow-up question to what you said. I mean, you basically talked about the fractures within the transatlantic alliance, within Europe, within the US, but there seems to be an East-West divide as well. I mean, this war has become the organizing principle of the East-West divide as well. And the question is that whether the perspectives of the Eastern countries or East in general differs sharply from the West with regard to Russia. I mean, this really become an organizing principle and a fracture between the East and West. Both in terms of democracy versus authoritarianism, multilateralism, the role of the United Nations, and this and that. Do you see a pattern like that? And do you have a follow-up question as well?
Well,
yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I'm just making a note of the question so I don't lose track.
East-West or West-South, but my question is maybe more complicated and very simple, and that is, can there be an easing out of this war without Chinese involvement, and can the United States accept that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Soli. Right. Well, let me, because it sort of falls on from what I was just saying, talk about this East-West divide. I think Soli might have just started to say what I was going to say, because actually it's also maybe North-South divide. Because if you look at the Scandinavian countries, which again is, I know this is not in the hands of TÜSİAD, but, being very careful about, how Sweden and Finland are, dealt with here. There is a lot of solidarity and, the grouping for the Joint Expeditionary Force, the JEF, which is all of the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Finland, Sweden, the Baltic countries, Denmark, and the United Kingdom. And then I would also add in there Poland. Those countries are all on the same page. And that would be the North, right? It's the Baltic North Sea countries who are very gung-ho in terms of support of Ukraine, and probably even more forward-leaning than any of the other countries there. The Danes are in that as well. Probably you might add the Dutch to some degree. And so that's kind of it's a very interesting, but I think there's more of a sort of a common perspective on, rolling back the Russians. And a lot of that is looked at the viewpoints from World War II. The Brits are sort of seeing their inner Churchill kind of being revived again. And there is an awful lot of cooperation among those countries. Again, this Joint Expeditionary Force, kind of looking at, pushing back Russia in the Baltic Sea, the North Sea, the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, for example. It's all back to that old, kind of Northern European, vantage point. So it's not simple as East-West. France and Germany kind of outliers there. When you think about Spain and Portugal, obviously they're further away from Russia, but the Spanish, had a real jolt to their perceptions of Russia during the time of the Catalonia independence crisis, because they discovered that the Russians, through their Spanish language propaganda outlets, Radio Sputnik, RT, in places like Venezuela and Latin and South America, and also in Portuguese language, that were kind of playing a similar role, were playing a role against the Spanish government and trying to stir things up in Catalonia. They have lots of reports. I've seen those reports. They're not classified. They're out there in kind of public. And the Spanish, that gave them a real shock. And that really, this is a while back, already obviously, started to do a reassessment, just like after 2016 in the UK with the Russian interference and in the United States in the election, and in the UK, as a result of the Skripal poisoning and many other of the actions taking place in London, that did a reassessment as well. So it's really Italy, France, and Germany well, Hungary, for obvious, kind of reasons. I mean, we think, that's a real outlier in all kinds of ways with Orban and Hungary, and also because Hungary has, honestly, some territorial aspirations towards Ukraine in Uzhgorod and the area of Hungarian minority. Orban's playing all kinds of, weird games at all times. The France and the French, Germany and Italy are somewhat outliers from some of the other European, their immediate neighbours. A lot of anxiety, obviously, in Romania, and right now Bulgaria, real soul searching. Romanians worried about what's going to happen, with Moldova, Western Balkans. I mean, even a reassessment there of, their previously close relationships with Russia, obviously after what Russia did in Montenegro, for example, or with Greece, in terms of trying to spoil the reconciliation between North Macedonia and Greece. And, kind of when the Greek patriarch, obviously the Orthodox patriarch sitting in Istanbul, but, kind of as long as the Greek government recognizing Ukrainian autocephaly, the independence of the Ukrainian church and the Russian reaction to that, there's been a lot of reassessment in many of the European countries about their relationships, with Russia. So the divisions are not quite as neat as they look. And, the United States is being pushed a lot by the Poles and the Balts and the Brits. I mean, I think, part for the US is kind of seeing Britain, so far out of there. One could argue that Britain's looking for a new role. As I said, the inner Churchill is being revived. Not just Zelensky looks like the new Churchill. Boris Johnson wanted to be Churchill. Everybody is going to kind of trying to kind of play that role of the great kind of wartime leader. But the UK is, kind of been more into this. Not just because of the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, when Britain, like the United States, actually made assurances to Ukraine that it would protect or support its territorial integrity and sovereignty and independence if there was an attack after it gave up nuclear weapons, but also because for the UK, they do see this. Everyone I talk to, not just me seeing this, as a student of world history, as a kind of replay in many respects of a World War I and World War II. This is, again, the third great power conflict over territory, not just a territorial dispute, but the invasion of one European country by another in a century. Germany did it twice, and now Russia, and in many respects, it's a continuation of the things that we saw in World War I and World War II, of claims on territory and countries authoritarian or monarchical, in the case of the Kaiser, basically unchecked in their actions here. So I think that's why it makes it so kind of complicated to say, yes, this is definitely a pivot for Europe, but it's not entirely clear how this is going to play out. And there is coalitions of countries that are playing a much more forceful role. Neil Melvin from the Royal United Services Institute has talked about something which I thought was a kind of a clever idea of mini-lateralism. That you're going to have different regions playing, more of a role. And he was also referring to this joint expeditionary force, which is something, for Turkey, I think, to pay attention to, of the Balts, the Scandinavians, Britain, the Danes can probably be, put in that category, and the Dutch, kind of formulating, closer military ties and, thinking about different strategic, perspectives as that might be an element of that. Evren, which gets into, your kind of, point about that. There was a question then about the position of the Republican Party that was in the chat. That's really very complicated because there's this strong populist element in the Republican Party that we see in the Congress, and we see Fox News, manipulating things to their own interests, as we now see very clearly from the publicizing of all of these emails back and forth to Rupert Murdoch and the kind of Fox News people during the 2020 election in its aftermath. But behind the scenes, there is still the kind of Republican Party that you guys used to know and engage with on the Senate side and on the professional staff side, and on the, I would say, perhaps the silent majority of congressional Republican members who actually are more supportive of Ukraine and of staying the distance on this than you would think. But everyone's playing the political winds. How they say they lick your finger and you put it up to see which way the wind's blowing. I think there's a lot of that going on they're going on in everyone's politics, right? But I mean, especially now going on like that in the Republican Party. And, someone like DeSantis, it'd be interesting to see what kind of backlash he gets, because people are trying to stake out how much support they're going to get in the political primaries So taking positions on Ukraine, that's why I said that Ukraine's becoming part of US domestic politics, just as Russia did before, and that's very dangerous. It's a very dangerous situation. But I don't think that there's one coherent position for the Republican Party. I think it's actually, this is one of those elements. It's part of a battle for the soul of the Republican Party. And we'll have to see how that plays out. There is still a majority of people in the United States that continue to support the current United States policy towards Ukraine. But it's a question about, as we get closer to the 2024 election, about how those views will shift. And that's actually one of the things I'm doing here in Germany, is looking at the ties between all of the, socioeconomic issues, the politics, and, how this is going to play out vis-a-vis Ukraine and the, longer term support for either the war or, getting to some kind of resolution here. And then, Soli, your question of China. I think China's essential. Look, very interesting seeing what China just, I wouldn't say they actually pulled off, because they kind of stepped in on Saudi Arabia and Iran. I mean, I'm sure you're well aware, just like everybody else is, that there have been a lot of behind the scenes discussions between Saudi Arabia and Iran, with others playing a role, including the UK and even the US tacitly, to try to stabilize the situation in Yemen. I mean, a lot of this is really about Yemen, the Saudi-Iranian seeming rapprochement, because the whole war in Yemen was getting out of control. And it makes you wonder whether, something like this will happen down the line, because there's a perception that the Ukrainian war is getting out of control, which, is already evident. And, many people, myself included, feel that, China's role is inevitable in this one way or another. I mean, the only way one could imagine bringing Russia to the negotiating table in some fashion is really with China there, China's the only country with any, particularly leverage over Russia. The question is, however, how much leverage do they have, and would they be willing to use it? Which, kind of think is a big question mark. I think the more that Russia feels constrained, and this is, where all the sanctions are actually Turkey, UAE, and, the country's determination to either act as a safe haven for Russian cash and oligarchs and Kremlin, operatives, or to, kind of tighten the screws a bit. I mean, all of that is pretty important. As long as Russia thinks it's got lots of options, then, kind of it won't go anywhere near the table, because Putin is willing to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of people. Whether they're willing to be sacrificed or not is another thing we'll have to see. But Putin's certainly willing to sacrifice all of them. But if the Chinese start to think that it's running, counter to their interest, then, they may actually play a role here. Because I think, Yemen was starting to run counter to China's interests as well, even though they're not really affected there because of the growing instability in the Middle East and China wanting to get more oil and gas, oil in particular from Iran as well as from Saudi Arabia. And it's a bit difficult when, these two big producers and sources of energy are loggerheads with each other. So eventually, China may play a role, but if it's with the United States driving towards the table, then that would be very difficult, because China will want concessions from the United States, which is why I said I don't think this can be resolved by the United States on its own. It has to be resolved in a multilateral format, because if it's just the United States driving everything, everyone wants a quid pro quo with the United States. And frankly, it's not the United States' business to give a quid pro quo on Ukraine. This isn't Yalta 1945. Or Tehran or Potsdam or any of the other, kind of big conferences. I mean, part of the problem that we had with this was people still perceive it as a kind of proxy war, as a kind of a proxy conflict. And this is about, territorial disputes or Western, European dominance. And it isn't so much that. It's just that, of course, we have a hard time putting a different frame on it. But nonetheless, I think, Soli, as you're suggesting there, that China, it's inevitable that China's got to play a role here. The question is, in what form and how. And Russia is becoming increasingly dependent on China in quite dangerous ways for Russia, I would say, over the longer term. And I mean, that's something for Turkey to factor in as well. I mean, you could very well end up with a Russia in your neighbour and this other Black Sea that is massively dependent on China, economically, politically, and in security terms as well. And that would, upset the balance. That's not just then about Russo-Turkish relations in the Black Sea anymore, but more about how do you factor China into that equation.
Right. I mean, there were many questions from the audience in China, so I think they were all answered by now with this, with what you have said. Let me read a question from Serhat Güvenç, which is on the role of Turkey. And the question is, goes like this. Regarding the medium-term prospects for rethinking European security, you have implied that Turkey would have a great deal of agency in deciding whether it will be part of a transformed European security or not. Do you think it will be only up to Turkey to choose its side? How about Turkey's current and future partners in Europe? How ready are they to accommodate Turkey in any security structure other than NATO? There are a couple of other questions. Let me group them and direct them to you. One question is about whether this war is about regime change. Is it about leadership? Is it structural, or is it about Putin? A question, the causes of the war, and whether the change of the regime is going to end the war. This is from Ahmet Üzümcü. Alaaddin Yalçınkaya asks whether this conflict is a UK-European conflict, which is the follow-up question what you have briefly talked about in terms of the fractures within the Western states. There is also one more question about the droning of the US drone in the Black Sea and the escalation dynamics. You use the analogy of World War I and World War II, and there is also this analogy of whether this conflict is going to escalate into a Third World War. So these are the questions, I guess, many more questions, but just let me direct only this group of questions to you right now. Do you have questions? No, okay.
Yeah, Soli, I hope that you'll kind of, come in on some of these things as well, because obviously you've got quite a lot to say on this. Look, the Third World War issue, I myself have, warned of, that prospect, and in fact have called it that in some respects. I just want to clarify, look, when a lot of people think of Third World War, they start to think of a nuclear exchange between the superpowers, between Russia and the United States. That's not necessarily what that has to be. If you think about what World War I and World War II were, they were both, wars over the future disposition of territory. They were, wars where one, country in World War I and World War II wanted to take over the territory of others. In the case of World War I, it was when Germany moved into, Belgium and France. And we're basically trying to resolve the centuries of disputes or decades of disputes with France, moving through Belgium and occupying that territory, and the war was all to expel them from that. But of course, there were many other things going on in that war as well, weren't there? That wasn't just the only trigger, because it starts off, we all think about Gavril Princip and shooting, the Austrian, Crown Prince nephew in Franz Josef in Sarajevo. How did that lead to Germany invading, Belgium and France? Basically, that there was a spark that ignited a whole bunch of other conflicts in Europe, and that's what we're seeing here as well. We're seeing a lot of knock-on effects on other conflicts inside of Europe as well, which is why it's not just a UK, or other, European war. The UK may have its own reasons, for supporting Ukraine. Most countries usually do. But it's basically because it sees it's a factor of a continuation of events of World War I and World War II in terms of violations of territorial integrity and, principles of independence and sovereignty, and the violation of the UN Charter. Everything that we said, we would not permit to happen again after World War I and World War II, with Germany in World War II, trying to take the Sudetenland, Poland, Anschluss with Austria, et cetera, et cetera. But you've also, as I said, you've got these other conflicts that we're seeing being affected by this war. Look at Armenia and Azerbaijan, right on, Turkey's territory. Azerbaijan would not, I would argue, have moved into, Karabakh again had it not been for the distraction of what Russia was doing in the case of its pressure on Ukraine and war in Donbass. We've got the conflict still kind of playing out, disputes in Moldova, the pressure being put on Moldova, Belarus being absorbed by, Russia, with people paying, very little attention there. The tensions, elsewhere in Europe being exacerbated, by this conflict, and other countries taking advantage of it. and some countries taking sides. Iran and North Korea, for example, supporting Russia, countries thinking about how they can cash in on this conflict. It's that kind of complexity that you see in other countries trying to stay neutral, not be part of this at all, and trying to say that it's a war between all these other countries. When, at the fundamental heart of this conflict, it's that violation of the UN Charter. It's, kind of a post or neo-colonial land grab on the part of Russia. Many people are forgetting that Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, that Ukraine was also part of the non-aligned movement, that, Ukraine has never colonized any other country, and that, Ukraine, was, along with Russia, a continuator or successor state of the Soviet Union, even if Russia was just recognized as such. And, this war would be as if Britain tried to take back Ireland or, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, any of its other, colonial territories. So, there's a lot of complexity to this conflict here. And that's what happens when you have, kind of a world war, let's say. It's a war with global impacts. And I think that that's what we're seeing, whether we like it or not, in the case of Ukraine. And in part, why is that different from Yemen or Iraq or Afghanistan? It's because of, Ukraine's strategic location and, what Ukraine stands for. It's the largest country territorially in Europe, not in terms of population, but in terms of landmass, after Russia. I mean, it's larger than Turkey, it's larger than Germany, it's larger than France, not in population. It's in the top 10. But it's also the strategic role that Ukraine has played, whether people were aware of it or not, on world food and food security, grain and sunflower oil and all kinds of other commodities, fertilizer, and also fuel. I mean, there's, all kinds of issues that have now been upturned because of, Ukraine as a transit country for energy. It was hoping to be an oil and gas producer itself, but also, the role that Ukraine has kind of played in military terms. I mean, we're now looking, and this is where something Turkey, this gets some of these other questions should be paying attention to. Ukraine could become, the largest European military after this war in terms of its armament and men under arms. Finland, which probably people are not paying attention to in Turkey, can have about 250,000 men under arms. And if they, do civil defense, they can have 800,000 on people under arms because they could call up everyone up until about 60. And there's many women as well, who can basically have civil defense roles, and they still do training for that. I was talking to the Finnish ambassador in the United States, and he's still got his call-up papers. And whenever he goes home, he has to go through every single person, no matter who they are, has a role to play, and they know exactly where they're supposed to turn up if they get called up. Finland is going to be one of the most military capable countries in NATO if it's brought in. It's not just going to be then, a dead weight on NATO. And this is why, I would basically say on that question about whether Turkey wants to be, part of European security or not, I think Turkey needs to decide. If Turkey is sort of seriously being part of European security, it has to think about it in a whole different context. And, European security, when there's a time of change can be driven by the periphery, not just the center. So there's a whole new security framework, I think, ahead of us here. I was in Norway at the very beginning of January and had some really interesting conversations with the Norwegians who were thinking about European security in the world very differently. They're not in the EU. They're not likely to be in the EU. They're thinking very much about these regional dynamics, which is, Turkey could be part of a Black Sea and an Eastern Mediterranean security perspective, but could also, join forces, with other parts of Europe for, regional initiatives. But the Norwegians are thinking about how they step up in more serious terms as well, and were very worried about why Turkey was holding up Finland and Sweden from that perspective. Notwithstanding what the arguments about this are, but that kind of is Turkey going to be a brake on the development of new European security? So it's not a question of whether countries are going to let Turkey in. It's whether Turkey itself wants to be part of this. And again, other European countries are thinking very differently about multilateralism. As I said, there's this idea of Neil Melvin and the Royal United Services Institute of minilateralism that would all add up together, different regional military cooperation emerging that would go beyond NATO, perhaps, and certainly beyond some of the current thinking about European security. So, at times of change like this, it's always very important, I think, for countries to be in the mix, rather than standing,
Fiona, allow me to interrupt, if I may.
Yes, please do.
What would be then the relation between NATO and the European Union? Because in the Turkish relation with the NATO partners, obviously, this is also something pretty important, especially as the profile of the Republic of Cyprus, what we call the Greek Cyprus administration, rises. And that, I think, is partially what Serhat was also alluding to. That is what I don't think it's as dismissible as you suggested, what the outlook of the partners of Turkey is about Turkey's future relations.
May I add to that, since we don't have much time? There are also follow-up questions with regard to this question that Soli just raised. Many people are asking the relationship between European army, European security, NATO, the role of Turkey, strategic autonomy of Europe, and the role that Turkey can play. So this is not just Soli's question, but that really created a lot of debate within the audience. So.
Well, look, I would advise you, I think you've got quite good relationships, Soli, right, with RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute. Ask Neil Melvin and some of his colleagues to come and, give a talk, because I think they're onto something really interesting. And I think a lot of the think tanks are going to be talking about this, because I think we're in a new world, or we're going to be in a new world as a result of this war. That's what I'm trying to scope out here. And look, Norway's not in EU. UK is unlikely to go back into the EU. Turkey's not in the EU, and there's going to be a lot of regional base. This is kind of what people are envisaging now because of these divides, Evren, that you were talking about, kind of before, of regional military efforts. I mean, England, in theory, has a bilateral military agreement with France, and we saw Rishi Sunak just in Paris trying to patch that relationship up. The Irish are rethinking, and the Icelanders about their kind of questions about neutrality. I mean, they're not perhaps likely to be in NATO, but I mean, who knows what's going to happen there. But there's a rethinking of the security space here. And, I think that it's all going to move beyond NATO and, thinking about the EU and European army. And if you want to be part of it, you get part of the discussions. So you need to shape things. And I mean, I think that in a way, that's why the UK is all so gung-ho, as, they say about the war in Ukraine, because the UK needs another anchor. It needs a different perspective. And it made commitments to Ukraine, and it's going to try to abide by them, but it's also then trying to find a new role for itself in a security framework, not just, an economic. I mean, and again, if you talk to the Finns and the Swedes, if it's not just about the issues, like Jake Sullivan said, the 127 other issues, kind of on the plate, but you actually have strategic discussions, not just laundry lists of complaints. You'll find that there's a whole host of rethinking about everything. So again, Finland and Sweden don't want to be in an old-style Cold War NATO. They want to be part of the debate about new European security. And the largest grouping of that is within NATO. I think the whole question about what the role the EU plays, it might be still some kind of division of labour, but that's probably not where most of the security discussions are going to take place, just to be frank. And there's no reason why Turkey couldn't think outside the box of the Black Sea and the Eastern Med and start talking to, if you patch up those relationships. Is why it's very short-sighted. I know it's not TÜSİAD, but it's very short-sighted to be holding up the horses on Sweden and Finland, because Finland is very pro-Turkish in the sense of, the larger wanting to have relations with Turkey, was always extraordinarily supportive of Turkey's accession to the EU. Frankly, so was Finland, back in the past. And Sweden and Finland could be actually good interlocutors on this larger context, not just on, important, but not the whole all-encompassing, issues related to security. I mean, you have your own, obviously domestic, which are extremely vital concerns, but there's also larger concerns. And, Finland and Sweden, now want to be part of that larger debate. And the Norwegians want them there to be part of that. The Norwegians are going to have a lot of leverage. And again, Finland is a serious fighting force. This isn't just, this isn't a country with no military. That's quite the contrary. And, if we were all like Finns, perhaps we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in, because, the Finns really do serious planning and, serious strategic thinking. And, kind of an engagement with the Finns, I think would be, pretty interesting, for, Turkish security. thinkers as well. But I would invite for a TÜSİAD event Neil Melvin and some of the people from RUSI, and maybe think about a way of partnering with them on some of these discussions, because the UK is in the same position, asking these same kinds of questions. And I mean, there's a great desire on the part of France and Germany to figure out how to reconnect with the UK on security. And, Turkey could also be part of that, because this whole question about then the future of the Black Sea, especially, given these recent incidents, and then also the Eastern Mediterranean. Because of, Russia's position in Syria and, all the knock-on effects there, and, what's going to happen, post-Yemen, there's so many questions out there. And I think, that it would be very important, just like in the early 1950s, for Turkey to be part of the discussions, because it's not a given that we're still going to have the NATO and the EU that we have today. I honestly think that everything is changing dramatically, or will change dramatically.
We practically ran out of time.
Oh, we did?
Actually, no, we could keep you forever.
Maybe 5 more minutes?
Just
I can stay for a few more minutes. I mean, I'm good as long as you guys.
Another simple, complicated question. Do you think the revitalization or reigniting of the interest that the US has for European security will continue unabated, given the fact that the priority for the United States is Asia and the resources are limited?
Well, I don't think the priority, ultimately, I'm not sure that the priority for the United States will emerge as being Asia. I mean, this has been a total fallacy of this kind of, whole idea of pivot. And, I think there's a very dangerous discussion about this inevitability of conflict with China. I mean, it's right there in The Economist, the latest edition, looking at war over Taiwan. We're barreling in that direction. It would be a good idea, I think, to stop us from, heading in that direction there. I mean, I'm disturbed all the time by, this sort of discussion as if there's no alternative. It's my old boss, Graham Allison's Thucydides trap. Mm-hmm. Also, Russia and China are fused together. That's what I'm saying. I said at the very beginning, in Turkey, Russia could very easily not become an independent actor shortly. And, kind of what's happening in Ukraine, everything is watching very closely, Russia being weakened, Russia becoming economically, politically, in security terms, dependent on China. That upsets, all the balance for India, for example, and other countries. Russia is an Asia-Pacific power. It still plays out, has a border with North Korea, as well as a huge long border with China and a disputed border with Japan still. So it has to be, factored in there. But look, I mean, there's always these other arguments within the United States about how much role the United States should play in the world, not just in Europe. I listened in on an event back at Brookings yesterday in which somebody was making these quotations about and looking at polling about whether people thought that the US should intervene in a war, and it was all about World War I and World War II. And in 1940, ahead of Pearl Harbor, 90% of Americans were saying that the United States should not intervene in Europe in World War II. 93%. And then Pearl Harbor changed everything, really dramatically. The United States always flips on this. Are we, kind of part of the world and more active, military, economic, politically engaged, or are we, looking more to our own internal problems? And of course, we've got 2024 in the election, and people like Ron DeSantis and others within the Republican Party who are running for office are emphasizing domestic issues and wanting to pull back. And they sound just like Americans in 1914, 15, 16, and Americans in 1939 and 1940. And I think that's why it gets back again to this issue about Europe, Eurasia, Near East, wherever we want to call this, geography, really trying to resolve things for itself in terms of all of those countries figuring out their security, to not be so dependent all the time on US leadership, US military, support, US economic, because it's not sustainable over the longer term. If we think now we've got more than a century of US intervention in Europe, it's not that the US is the imperial power, but there's just too much dependence, all the time on, the US firepower, as well as, US economic and, political leadership. And there does need to be more. I mean, Macron is right that there needs to be more strategic autonomy, writ large. You know, and part of the problem that we have all the time is the rest of the world, Turkey included, and, you know, India and much of, you know, Europe, and certainly the Russians always think about this is all about the United States, and it's not. And, you know, the more that we kind of think of the United States just as the framing for all this, we won't get out of it, because Ukraine is not about the United States. This is about Russia invading a neighbor, invading, you know, territory that it used to claim imperially. And, you know, it's all about the UN Charter and violation. And if Russia gets away with this, it's a free-for-all, frankly. You know, there's plenty of other disputes around Europe and elsewhere that this could be impacted by.
So are the Germans, you said the Germans recognize that they're at a turning point. Will they turn?
Yeah, that's, I think the jury's still out on this, because this is an existential crisis for Germany. I mean, I see it here.
Okay.
Because the whole German economic system is under question as well. I mean, my lunch meeting that I was a little bit late coming back from was super interesting, because, you know, that whole German industrial model is breaking down as well. Yeah. And the impact of digitalization, you know, the kind of the rise of, you know, AI and, you know, and as China and other countries become major manufacturing, you know, centers, is made in Germany, as they said, going to be, you know, sufficient for the future. And I think Germany's having, like many countries, there's just huge identity crisis and, you know, a real genuine economic and political crisis. And this Zeitenwende, yes, it's definitely a Zeitenwende, but it's like, which way is it all bending? Which way is it all turning? And I think, you know, the big fear here is that, you know, you'll turn and push so much that it'll break. Mm-hmm. And, you know, one might argue that happened in the United Kingdom. I mean, read The Economist, this month's issue. I mean, I wrote about that in, you know, the book that Soli and Evren, we were both referencing, you know, There's Nothing for You Here, why I left the UK, you know, as a young person in the 1980s. You know, this would have been 50 years this year of the anniversary of the UK joining the EU. And it joined the EU because of desperate economic and demographic circumstances. And 50 years on, it's exactly where it was in 1973 again. The Economist talks about 250,000 excess deaths in the United Kingdom and a catastrophic loss of life expectancy, because London always distorts the figures. You know, when you look at per capita incomes in the United Kingdom, it looks like the United Kingdom is a high, you know, kind of, you know, very rich country. But if you took London out of the equation, the per capita incomes in England are lower than parts of Eastern Europe, probably some of the lowest. And, you know, the UK in 1973 was the second poorest country in Europe, in the European Union, and it had took 27% of Europe's structural funds for regional development went to the United Kingdom in 1970s and 1980s.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
This was a stimulating discussion, and we are definitely going to follow up on your advice, inviting people and the teams that you suggested. Thank you so much for joining us.
And enjoy Berlin.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks. And if anyone's in Berlin, let me know. And if someone back the Bosch Foundation, let me know. And everyone, thank you so much. And it's always such a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
With some TÜSİAD. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.